For most of us, the medieval battlefield is a stage of grand heroes, clashing swords and valiant duels. Hollywood has shown us clean-faced knights, perfectly timed charges and battles decided by one-on-one combat. But that's the fantasy. The reality? A living nightmare, where mud, blood, and confusion drowned strategy, and survival often depended not on strength, but on sheer luck. Today, we peel back the curtain on this gritty past to discover what a real medieval battle was like and why it was far more terrifying than any movie. Before the first sword was ever raised, a medieval battle began with the most punishing of human tests: waiting. Imagine standing for hours, sometimes even an entire day, in a muddy field, weighed down by iron armor, a wooden shield strapped tight, your breath clouding in the cold morning air. The men around you, farmers, blacksmiths, peasants, all waiting shoulder to shoulder, trying not to show their fear. There were no grand speeches, no swelling orchestral music like the movies. Instead, there was boredom, anxiety, and the creeping stench of unwashed bodies, urine and sweat. Nerves frayed to the point that some men soiled themselves, others vomited where they stood. Veterans muttered quiet prayers, others stared blankly ahead, already lost in dread. Behind the lines, knights prepared their war horses, tightening straps and testing lances, but even they were not immune to fear. One wrong move, and even the mightiest could be trampled or slain. Then came the commanders, often nobles or seasoned warriors, barking final orders, drawing lines in the mud, sometimes arguing over strategy with heated whispers. There were no perfect formations. Many armies were disorganized mobs, held together by sheer will and duty. And finally, the war cries. Not the heroic kind, but a necessary ritual, a guttural, desperate attempt to silence the fear inside. A roar that told yourself and your enemy, "I am not afraid," even when every part of you screamed otherwise. By the time the first orders were shouted and the march began, many soldiers were already exhausted, their courage worn thin by the weight of their own minds. When the signal to advance finally came, the illusion of control shattered instantly. Lines of men surged forward, not like the coordinated ranks shown in movies, but as an uneven, jostling mass. Feet slipped on mud slick with morning dew. Spears bristled like a chaotic forest. Shields banged together in the push forward, and the air filled with the low rumble of hundreds of boots stamping the earth. Then, the impact. The first clash was not a clash of swords, but of bodies. It was a violent, crushing collision, a wall of wood, metal, and flesh smashing together. Bones snapped, men screaming screamed. You couldn't swing your sword with the elegance of a duel. You jabbed, shoved, hacked, often blindly. The press was so tight that soldiers were wedged shoulder to shoulder, barely able to raise their arms. Breathing became a battle of its own. The air grew hot, heavy with the stink of sweat, blood, and fear. If you fell, tripped, wounded, or simply pushed down, you didn't get back up. You were trampled, crushed, suffocated under layers of men. Spears broke, axes found flesh. A sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a pry bar to push your opponent back, a bludgeon when the blade chipped, a last gasp of survival. And the noise, it wasn't the ringing of clashing steel, it was raw, ugly, deafening, men groaning, shrieking, The wet slap of weapons on flesh, the crunch of bones, the hiss of arrows overhead. Commanders shouted orders, but few heard them. Horns blew, but the chaos drowned them out. Friend and foe became indistinguishable in the melee. Your survival depended on muscle memory, luck, and sheer will to live. This was not the choreographed dance of cinema. This was chaos incarnate. Death was messy, painful, and deeply personal. Every enemy had a face, and every swing carried the weight of desperation. Some men fought in a trance, driven by terror and adrenaline. Others froze, paralyzed by the horror around them. And for many, the first clash was the last thing they ever saw. Yet amidst the carnage, small pockets of discipline sometimes emerged. Shields locked, spears thrust in unison, forming brief walls of order in the maelstrom. But these never lasted. The sheer brutality of close combat overwhelmed even the best formations. The first clash was not just a test of strength, it was a trial of the mind. Who could hold their sanity together in a place designed to break it? Once the first clash breaks, the battlefield becomes what soldiers feared most, the killing grounds. There's no honor here, no grand duels or shining champions, only exhausted men, bleeding and breathless, surrounded by death in every direction. The ground becomes slick with blood and mud, making every step dangerous. Dead bodies become obstacles. Sometimes you trip, other times you step on the wounded, still moaning for mercy. And this is where the movies lie the most. Battles weren't clean cinematic affairs, they were slow, grinding slaughters. Blades dulled, shields splintered. Men wielded whatever they could find, maces, broken spears, even stones. A shield bashed to the face could shatter teeth, a pommel strike to the temple could kill. The killing grounds had no clear lines. It was a swirling storm of desperate faces. If you were lucky, you fought with your brothers nearby, a familiar face in the fog of war. But isolation meant death. Alone, you became an easy target, encircled, stabbed from all sides. And still, commanders shouted, banners waved, but few could see them amidst the dust, smoke, and gore. Archers and crossbowmen found high ground or stood behind the melee, sending volleys of arrows, often indiscriminately. Friendly fire was common. A lucky shot could pierce a helmet and drop a seasoned warrior in an instant. Horses, when used, became battering rams, smashing through ranks, but cavalrymen risked being pulled from their mounts and butchered on the ground. In the center of this nightmare stood the so-called heroes, the knights, the seasoned champions. But even they weren't invincible. Armor helped, but exhaustion did not discriminate. The weight of steel, the suffocating heat, the relentless chaos, it ground even the best into pulp. A battlefield didn't make heroes, it consumed them. Sometimes no side truly won the killing grounds. Both armies bled until neither could stand. What was left was a field of corpses, torn banners fluttering weakly, and the stench of rot settling in before the sun had even set. For those who survived, the screamings and sights haunted them forever. For those who died, they became part of the mud, indistinguishable from the rest. The weapons of medieval warfare, often romanticized, often misunderstood. In movies, swords gleam, axes cleave, and arrows strike with pinpoint precision. But in truth, the tools of war were as crude as they were deadly, designed not for grace, but for survival. Let's begin with the sword. Contrary to the myth of the heavy, unwieldy broadsword, most swords were surprisingly balanced. A long sword, for instance, typically weighed around 3 pounds, crafted for swift, repeated strikes. Yet, a sword was rarely your first weapon in battle. It was often your last resort. The real workhorses? Spears and polearms. Spears were cheap, easy to make, and deadly in formation. A wall of spears could hold back even the fiercest cavalry. Polearms, like the halberd, combined axe, spear, and hook in one, capable of unseating knights or splitting armor at weak points. And then there was the war hammer. Forget the clumsy mallets seen on screen. The real war hammer was compact, designed to crush through plate armor with brutal efficiency. One good strike could shatter bones beneath steel. Axes, too, played a role, especially in the hands of Viking descendants or heavy infantry. A bearded axe could hook and pull shields aside, exposing the enemy's body for the killing blow. As for bows, the English longbow stands out. Its range and power could pierce lightly armored foes from over 200 yards away. Yet, it required immense strength and training. The draw weight could exceed 150 pounds. No casual archer, no matter how heroic on screen, could master it overnight. Crossbows were the great equalizer, easier to train, capable of penetrating chainmail, but slow to reload. In siege warfare, the crossbow was both feared and despised. And then came fire, not in the form of flaming arrows, but through Greek fire-like substances in siege engines. Rare but devastating when used. Reality check. Weapons broke, edges dulled. The battlefield was littered with makeshift weapons, bones, rocks, broken shafts turned into spears. Unlike the polished weapons of film, true medieval arms were tools of necessity, stained with sweat, blood, and the grime of endless war. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that defined survival. It was the hand that held it, the strength behind the strike, and the will to kill before being killed. Victory on a medieval battlefield was not a clear-cut affair. It wasn't the heroic cheers we see in films. It was exhaustion, trauma, and disbelief. The victorious army, perhaps composed of 13th century French knights in chainmail adorned with surcoats bearing their heraldic symbols, and their levied footmen in rough linen tunics and padded gambesons, would be drenched in sweat, blood, and mud. After the chaos, their first task was not celebration, it was looting. The fallen were stripped of armor, swords, and even their boots. Armored English men-at-arms of the 14th century, in partial plate and brigandines, would methodically check bodies for valuables. Weapons were prized, especially swords and maces, which were expensive and sometimes named heirlooms. But looting came with danger. Wounded enemies might feign death, only to lash out in desperation. Disease was rampant. The stench of open wounds and decay set in within hours. Corpses left in the sun, dressed in woolen tabards and leather belts, would swell and rot. For the defeated, the nightmare didn't end. Survivors faced brutal executions, ransoms, or enslavement. Captured mercenaries like the Swiss pikemen or lanzknechts of the late 15th century might be spared for ransom if their colors or commanders held value. Others, especially peasants, were often killed on the spot. Villages nearby suffered as well. Armies plundered local settlements for food, livestock, and women, a grim fact rarely shown in cinema. The civilians, often dressed in simple flax or wool garments, barefoot or in crude leather sandals, bore the true cost of these so-called victories. And yet, despite all this, chroniclers would later write embellished tales of glory and honor. Kings and lords like Edward III of England or Philip VI of France immortalized their victories in tapestries and songs, masking the trauma with poetry. When we think of medieval battles, most of us imagine the thrilling chaos of Hollywood. Knights charging in shining armor, sword fights choreographed like dances, and lone heroes turning the tide. But reality was grimmer, slower, and far more brutal. In the real world, battles weren't cinematic duels. Most combat was short, clumsy, and ended in a fatal blow, not prolonged exchanges. A soldier's greatest enemy wasn't just the blade, but exhaustion, mud, and terror. A fully armored knight, like those from 15th century Europe, could barely fight for more than a few minutes before becoming physically spent, even though their armor was surprisingly mobile for its weight. Also, not every soldier was a knight in shining armor. Common infantry wore simple padded gambesons, chainmail if they were lucky, and wielded spears or pole arms. They formed dense formations, relying on collective strength, not individual prowess. And what about the loud, swelling orchestras that movies love? In truth, battles were filled with the sounds of human agony, muffled commands, and the metallic cacophony of clashing weapons. Fear was palpable, and amidst the noise, soldiers barely distinguished friend from foe. Moreover, battles rarely ended in clean victories. More often, the aftermath was a brutal mopping-up operation, with routing soldiers butchered, wounded left crying for help, and fields littered with bodies, stripped of armor and valuables. So why do movies misrepresent medieval warfare? Because reality is too raw. A true depiction would be disorienting, blood-soaked, and emotionally devastating. Yet understanding this difference isn't just about correcting Hollywood, and as the dust settles on the battlefield, one truth remains. The reality of medieval combat was far from the choreographed heroism seen in films. It was messy, brutal, and deeply human. No soaring speeches, no perfectly timed duels. Just exhausted men fighting to survive, often barely able to see or hear in the chaos, driven by orders, instinct, or sheer will to live. These were battles not of glory, but of mud, blood, and fatigue. Soldiers weren't superheroes, they were farmers with spears, mercenaries hardened by pay, or knights hoping their expensive armor would save them from an unseen blade. The victors carried more than trophies. They carried scars, both physical and mental. The defeated often lost, not just their lives, but their entire communities, in the wave of destruction that followed. So next time a movie shows a lone warrior standing against many, remember, the true battlefield was far less romantic. But understanding it connects us to a past that's raw, real, and essential to who we are today. War, in any age, is never as clean as the stories we tell.